And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. James Marquardt, who will talk to us about morality in American foreign policy, the future of the international order. Professor Marquardt is Chair of International Relations and Associate Professor of Politics at Lake Forest College. He received his PhD in political science and his MA in International Relations and Affairs at the University of Chicago. At Lake Forest College, he teaches courses ranging from Introduction to Global Politics through a senior level seminar on democracy in peace and war, and has received numerous awards and honors for his teaching excellence. He has written a book, Transparency and American Primacy in World Politics, and is currently revising an academic article on American foreign policy during the Obama administration. Welcome, Jim Marquardt. Jim, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ada. Thank you to all of you for hosting me. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great.
A little louder, please.
Okay.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. So typically I do most of my Zooming during the week, during classes. I'm teaching from home. Today is, of course, a rare exception, and I want to thank you all for welcoming me. Special thanks to Joanne for inviting me to come talk to you today. So my presentation today is titled Morality in American Foreign Policy, with particular attention on the future of the international order. And this may sound kind of archaic, but essentially what I'm going to be talking about today is that we're at an inflection point in our international relations. The existing international order, which has governed much of international relations, some for the good, some not so good, which of course has been dominated mostly by the United States, is now beginning to fade. And the question is, what comes next? And what role, if any, can the United States play in constructing a new international order? And what I want to do here is to reflect upon how bringing in certain moral questions or moral elements to our foreign policy may help the United States to restructure international order in a way that certainly advances our interests, but also serves the well-being of the global community. So let me begin. Much of the nation's and the world's attention nowadays, of course, is on COVID, and rightly so. This pandemic has been catastrophic for peoples and nations the world over. It is, in effect, a world war of sorts. According to Johns Hopkins University Online Coronavirus Resource Center, as of Friday, February the 5th, the virus has killed 2.3 million people and infected 105 million people. In the US, the number of killed continues to accelerate and will surely surpass 1/2 million within a short period of time. In addition, there are over 27 million diagnosed cases of COVID in the United States. There is, of course, some good news to report. The 14-day average of new cases has fallen by about 30%. And as about 9% of Americans have received at least one of the 2 doses of either the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccines. And of course, more vaccines will soon be available both in the United States and abroad. Yet little attention has been given to the international relations of the pandemic and how the pandemic is playing out in American foreign policy. My argument today is that the pandemic magnifies what we have already seen in terms of a deepening, a widening, and a lengthening of major cracks in the current international order. These problems have been evident for some time, of course, but an event like this pandemic magnifies them. Consider some of the following evidence. In 2005, members of the World Health Organization, in particular the member countries, signed a protocol specifying their legal obligations in the event of a new health emergency. This legal document was called the International Health Regulations, or the IHR. The IHR established an accounting system to ensure that states are coming into compliance with the guidelines, thereby better ensuring a seamless worldwide strategy to reduce the risk of a global health emergency and to better manage the emergency if it were to occur. Yet, as the COVID virus spread within and among countries, countries acted contrary to the IHR protocols. Perhaps the most egregious example is the delay by China in reporting to the WHO of a health emergency in the city of Wuhan, which would become, of course, COVID-19. And China's further decision to deny the WHO scientists timely access to the city. In fact, only in mid-January, well over a year after the outbreak, did the Chinese government formally allow WHO experts into Wuhan. And only last week were the inspectors allowed to enter the bat virology lab, where it is believed by some that the virus may have originated. Also contrary to WHO guidelines, countries unilaterally put in place travel bans without consulting or coordinating with the WHO. Furthermore, countries are now competing with one another, racing to sign contracts with vaccine manufacturers to ensure that they have the doses of the vaccine to inoculate their citizens. Meanwhile, poor countries, where COVID-19 mitigation efforts are weakest, face a looming disaster, as people have the prospect of having to wait many months, if not several years or more, for a vaccine, all because their governments cannot afford to pay for them up front. COVAX, which is an international mechanism established by the WHO and other non-governmental organizations to give poor countries vaccines, is grossly underfunded. And adding insult to injury, the goal of COVAX to undertake its inoculation efforts only applies to about 20% of the people who live in poor countries. So the pandemic raises big issues about international relations. And what about American foreign policy? As the coronavirus pandemic spread and the need for international policy coordination and the resources to stem the tide grew, the United States declared its intention to leave the World Health Organization. Then President Donald Trump accused the WHO executive leadership of going easy on China, which, like the US, is a major funder of the WHO. Last May, he gave the WHO an ultimatum: either initiate major reforms within 30 days, or the US would quit the organization and perhaps not pay its remaining dues. Citing the WHO's refusal to act on greatly needed reforms and declaring that the WHO lacked independence and that China had total control over the organization, 10 days after he made this announcement, he formally announced the US exit from the WHO, taking by surprise both the WHO leadership and his administration's top public health officials, who have been working diligently to meet the president's reform mandates. So the pandemic raises big questions about international relations. Can countries cooperate to solve big problems? If so, what's required to ensure that policy coordination and that countries can achieve their shared goals? It also asks us if international order is indeed possible in international relations. And if so, can an international order also ensure justice, or to ensure that things that happen are indeed right and good for most people and countries? And when it comes to American foreign policy, these questions come to mind. Can and ought the United States lead the world? If so, how might morality function as a compass to guide American foreign policy in these challenging times, both on COVID and on other major pressing global challenges, such as climate change. These are questions that scholars, leaders, and people like yourselves have been grappling with for a very long time. In the little time that we have today, I want to offer some insights as to how we might approach these questions and thereby identify pathways for deeper personal reflection and community involvement. So let me begin with a preliminary insight. I'm a college professor. I teach and conduct research in the political science subfield of international relations. And one of the first insights that I share with my students who take my introductory course in international relations is this: politics among countries, what we call international politics, is fundamentally different than politics within countries, what we call domestic politics. How so? Well, unlike politics within countries, politics between countries plays out in the absence of a higher authority. That is, within countries, we have governments and constitutions and laws. And for as much as we might rail against the government, for instance, we nevertheless recognize the government as a legitimate institution that exercises authority over us on issues of public importance, where decisions have to be made by a government on behalf of the whole group or members of a community. We use the term international anarchy to refer to the absence of a higher authority in international relations. Anarchy does not mean chaos, however. It simply means the lack of a higher authority. Also, some scholars contend that international anarchy does not preclude international order, and that we can have justice and a well-ordered international community. Or to put it another way, politics between and among countries play out differently than domestic politics. We don't have a world government. Nonetheless, there are mechanisms in place, power politics, international institutions, norms, for instance, that have the effect of establishing some degree of predictability and stability in world affairs. So, what is international order? International order is a commonplace concept in international relations. Generally speaking, it means that interactions or relations between and among countries are arranged in such a way that give rise to patterned and therefore predictable behavior that promotes certain shared values and goals. 40 years ago, a leading theorist of international order observed that all societies, from the local level to the global level, strive for a common set of goals. We want to ensure our physical security and that of our countries and peoples. We want to ensure that the promises we make to each other are promises that are kept. And we want to ensure that the ownership of material things, from our homes and our automobiles to our national territory, are not subject to repeated challenges. International order has various sources. One of them is power politics, the power dynamics among countries. But international order is also governed by a common set of rules, norms, and institutions. So when they speak of international order, scholars and statespeople maintain that there is in fact a society of states. That is, where states have a conscious understanding that they have core common interests and values, and they consider themselves further to be bound by a set of rules in their relations with one another. States, in effect, are in a relationship with one another. And when you're in a relationship, you have certain obligations to the other. They have a sense of what others expect of them, and they have an expectation about being treated in a particular way. This is what a relationship is all about. Now, the point I want to make about international order is that international order and international relations come and go from one period of time to another. However, our sense of international society, that is, countries being part of a community, remains with us, even though the order that governs international relations at times will change. Now, according to many scholars, international relations since World War II has played out in what we call now the American international order. Others call this the rule-based order or the liberal international order. And by liberal, scholars mean a tradition of politics and political philosophy that's rooted in the Enlightenment, that values human freedom, the rule of law, and limited government. In this context, the word liberal has nothing to do with domestic politics in the United States. What follows is a definition of the American international order that I have borrowed from a book recently published by a scholar at Princeton, John Eikenberry, titled A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Democracy and the Crisis of World Order. This is how he defines the American international order. Quote, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States and its partners built a new type of international order, organized around open trade, cooperative security, multilateralism, democratic solidarity, and American leadership. Regional and global institutions were established to facilitate cooperation, to enshrine shared norms, and to bind societies together. Western Europe overcame centuries of division to launch a project of integration and political union. West Germany and Japan reinvented themselves as civilian powers and became stakeholders in the post-war liberal system. Across the industrial world, the post-war period was a golden era of economic growth and social advancement. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, this American-led international order expanded outward across the globe. Everything that Western liberal internationalists believed in and promoted seemed to be on the move and going in the right direction, unquote. Now, evident in Eikenberry's definition of the international order, the American international order, are 2 points that I think are particularly important. The first is that the American international order helped advanced industrialized countries transcend their differences, and especially their competitive warlike behavior towards one another, and to help them forge a new relationship that resulted in a long peace, in impressive levels of economic growth and development, and the advancement of freedom and welfare and the well-being of their peoples. The second point I draw from the very last element of his definition. That is the notion that this existing American international order is now imperiled. Indeed, Eikenberry goes on to write that nowadays, voices and policies in the United States are actively hostile to the core ideas of the American order. He writes, and I'm quoting him, in areas such as trade, alliances, multilateralism, human rights, immigration, rule of law, and democratic solidarity, there are those who have actively and undermined the American-led post-war order, both within the United States and abroad. So let's take a step back for a moment and consider the possibility that we could be heading away from an American international order. Perhaps such a development is not a bad thing after all. Other scholars suggest that American international order may have solved some big problems that have plagued international relations for a long time. Namely, the US is now at peace with Japan, with Europe. But other countries, such as Russia and China, and many developing countries, have either not been fully integrated into this order or have been gravely damaged by what they consider to be not an American international order, but an American liberal imperium, what in international relations we call hegemony, a Greek word for dominance. Another book that I'm reading and that I've assigned to one of my classes this year is by Patrick Porter. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Birmingham in England. He wrote in his 2020 book, The False Promise of the American Order, the following, quote, "Most advocates of the American liberal order believe it is a good thing and worth defending. In opposition, however, there are skeptics. Most of them argue that liberal order is a false promise, that the American order is a master concept that will do more to hinder international relations than to help it. They believe that the American order was never truly whole and that it was never truly just. Moreover, neither the United States nor any power in history has risen to dominance by being ethical, by being straightforward or truthful. To support thinking otherwise, Porter argues, covers up a bloodier, more conflicted, and more imperial history of a superpower, the United States, driven by ruthless power-seeking behavior and messianism. Now, there's something to be said with both points of view. That is, the more favorable view of American order and the less favorable view of American order. Consider this for a moment. What will the world look like today if, in the absence of American leadership and American order building and international relations over the past 75 years? An order that I mentioned a few minutes ago brought many countries together to form a security community and to advance global economic growth and integration. I simply can't imagine a unified Europe, rapprochement between Germany and France, economic globalization, and the scores of effective international institutions that exist in the world today in the absence of American order. On the same token, however, we simply cannot deny the fact that in its relations with other states, especially those that remained outside of the American order for much of the Cold War, the US has behaved as Porter describes, namely as an imperial power, as a crusader state. Think about the war in Vietnam, during which 2 million Vietnamese died, where America used chemical weapons, and some US forces committed what we now today would call war crimes. Or perhaps let's consider something more recent, the 2003 Iraq War and the occupation of that country that followed, which included the loss of tens of thousands of lives of Iraqi civilians, the use of torture against suspected terrorists, some of who died as a consequence, and for which no high-ranking member of the military or the US government has ever been called to account, let alone held accountable. And of course, the grave material costs to the United States in the several trillions of dollars, the loss of life, and the traumatic injuries to American soldiers, not to mention the loss of America's standing in the world. And what more recently, one might argue, is the Obama administration's practice of using drone strikes against suspected terrorists that have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of non-combatants. Also, take the troubling history and legacy of America ignoring human rights abuses around the world and allying with autocrats in Latin America, the Middle East, and East Asia, which contradicts the core feature of the American order, which is supposed to value human freedom and democracy. Think about former President Trump's public statement that the United States would not punish Saudi Arabia for the crown princes having ordered both the murder and the dismembering of the body of Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi. And I'm quoting the former president. Saudi Arabia is a big buyer of American products. That means something to me. It's a big producer of jobs in America. I'm no fool. Let's take their money. Unquote. How is it that America can at once be the guardian of a liberal order for some and represent an illiberal and immoral imperial force for others? I want to say two things here. First, Americans by and large see their country as uniquely virtuous and good, what scholars in political science call the American creed. Consistent with this creed, Americans trumpet great achievements like defeating fascism and winning the Cold War. However, we unfortunately blame the evil we see in the world and seek to confront as the cause of our own bad behavior. I don't know how to solve this problem, except to do my bit as an educator by encouraging the young Americans that I teach to think critically about their country's role in the world as being their patriotic duty. Second, greater attention to morality in American foreign policy among our statesmen and women, and their sharper cultivation of moral reasoning and foreign policy making, I believe offers a pathway for overcoming the dark side of American international order. And this is particularly important at this moment in time, when we have a new president and a new debate about whether, and if so, how, the United States can assert leadership on the world stage. So, where is the American order headed? The two leading candidates for the 2020 presidential election held very contrasting views of America in the world and American international order. Former President Donald Trump sought to loosen the ties that have bound the United States to this order, which earlier generations of American statespeople had created and managed. Trump's America First mantra painted a very unfavorable picture of American international order. According to this view, this order made it possible for other countries to take advantage of the United States, and the United States got little in return. For instance, Trump criticized the unfair trade rules. He criticized the Paris Climate Treaty as requiring the United States to significantly reduce its greenhouse gases, while greenhouse gas emissions would continue to rise dramatically in China. He criticized NATO countries and not carrying their fair share of the burden. Had President Trump been reelected, we would have likely have seen the continued US withdrawal from the international order that it had created in the 1940s. We would have seen a greater reassertion of American sovereignty, unilateralism, nationalism, and a more transactional approach where we treated our democratic allies no different than our autocratic adversaries. Now, the election of Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States, one might argue, is a reprieve from this Trumpian future. But the point I want to make is that it's not all that clear that the American international order can be pulled from the wreckage, or if it should be. Biden is a champion of American leadership in the world. He would like to see the revival of a new American international order. To this end, he wants the United States to work more closely with like-minded countries and for America to lead by the power of its example, not merely by the example of its power. In his first week in office, the new president has reversed core components of Trump's America First policy. America will rejoin the Paris Treaty and the WHO. It will end its military support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which has resulted in a major humanitarian crisis. The administration has moved quickly to renew and extend a new nuclear arms control agreement with Russia. And it's looking for a way to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. Biden's victory, in short, means that the United States undertaking policies to repair and to retrofit the American order, or at least salvage what it can from it. But let's make no mistake, we are not entering a back to the future moment here. To the extent that there ever was one, the golden era of the American international order is over. Biden said a few days ago that America is back. I think I know what he means. America will once again lead the world. But this leadership, if successful, will require hard work to encourage others to again have confidence in the United States. And for Americans, once again, to recognize that its leadership ought to be good both for America and for the world that it seeks to lead. Moreover, I think that a new American-led order will require a degree of collaboration that did not characterize the old order. Others will not follow the United States simply because we assert leadership. And America simply cannot go it alone, assuming it could have otherwise. Also, when Biden says America is back, critics like Porter, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, who is critical of the American international order, have good reason to be nervous. One might ask, let's be careful what we wish for. If America's comeback means things like war for regime change and retreating from human rights, then some might argue, maybe we don't want America back. The big question is this: can Biden deliver for America and the world in ways that avoid American imperial excesses and builds upon common values and goals that are shared by many countries? So, this takes me to the issue of morality in the conduct of foreign policy. Again, Biden does not explicitly call for the recreation or the restoration of the old American international order that emerged after World War II. But he argues nonetheless that the world will not organize itself. He blames the Trump administration for abdicating America's commitment to that order through a lack of leadership and a lack of concern for common values like democracy and human rights. But the unraveling of the American order did not start with Donald Trump, and we might think of Trump not as the cause of the unraveling, but rather as a symptom of it. Biden also concedes that American power, which for such a long time served as a main force of maintaining the order, can no longer ensure that order. What he has in mind is something a bit different, what I might call an American orchestrated multilateral order that comprises a broad community of countries, mostly liberal democracies, working in concert and utilizing their combined power and their principles to advance common interests. There is also room in this order for non-state actors, what we call transnational civil society groups, that are committed to things like strengthening democracy, addressing climate change, and promoting our core values. Biden's notion is that American global leadership starts at home. To this end, he then says that America must extend and revitalize the American economy in ways that focus on the well-being of the American people. In addition, Biden runs through a list of foreign policy positions that flow from American leadership. For instance, Biden concedes that the United States has been too quick to resort to the use of force, and that force is a last resort that should only be used when vital interests are at stake. Biden's emphasis on America working in concert with other countries that share our values underscores his commitment to renewing America's relations with our allies. Now, how might morality inform U.S. foreign policy under President Biden? On this point, let me turn to the work of Joseph Nye, who perhaps is the most well-known public intellectual of international relations in the United States today. A professor at the Kennedy School of Harvard University an author of many important books and articles, and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Nye's thinking about morality and foreign policy draws from both the ivory tower and from his government experience. Last year, Nye published a book that I assigned to my foreign policy students. The book is titled Do Morals Matter? And it's subtitled Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. In this book, he affirms that morals matter and shows that American statesmen have been overall somewhat successful at advancing morality in the conduct of American foreign policy. In laying the foundations for the American international order during and after World War II, he writes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower, who he collectively refers to as the founders, made sound moral judgments that advanced America's national interests and helped improve the global international system. But what makes a moral foreign policy? Nye says that moral reasoning is a skill that people have evolved, that we are in effect hardwired to make moral judgments. Moral reasoning, for Nye, has three dimensions: intentions, means, and consequences. By intentions, he means publicly expressed goals that are noble and that satisfy our common values, and that the goals to achieve these common values are feasible. Good intentions alone, however, are not sufficient for moral reasoning. The means to achieve our goals also matters. I'm quoting him now. We speak of means as effective if they help achieve our goals, he writes. But ethical reasoning also says that we must pay attention to the quality of these goals. Good moral reasoning asks about how our goals treat others. And finally, moral reasoning also deals with consequences. The ethical consequences of our actions ought to take into proper consideration the opinions of mankind and how our choices impact others. The consequences of our moral reasoning must be good for us and for others. Nye proposes in this book a scorecard to give the best moral foreign policy choices and to spell them out in context. When it comes to intentions, he asks if the leader expresses a good moral vision, and if in the exercise of foreign policy, the leader is prudent. That is, does the leader balance the values that she wants to pursue against the risks she faces by trying to impose these values on others? So, for instance, President Bush II justified the invasion of Iraq on the notion that America would advance the cause of human freedom in that country and throughout the greater Persian Gulf. Yet the high moral vision did not consider the risks that this endeavor entailed. Nye therefore says that on this criteria, Bush's decisions are immoral. When it comes to intentions, Nye asks if the use of force to advance a moral policy is absolutely necessary, and if so, whether the means used to advance the policy are used discriminately and proportionally. Also, Nye says, a good moral foreign policy, when it comes to intentions, must ask if the leader worked through existing institutions, both domestically and internationally. Finally, as for consequences, Nye asks if the leader was a good fiduciary. That is, was the leader able to advance long-term interests that are good for the country and good for the world? More importantly, does the leader consider the interests of other people, that is, those who are outside the United States? Did the leader act truthfully? Did the leader build credibility by broadening moral discourse both at home and abroad? As for Trump's foreign policy, Nye gives it generally average or slightly poor grades for moral vision, for respect for rights and institutions, for minimizing the damage of others, and for truthfulness. Nye gives Trump fairly good grades for balancing values against risks and for advancing the long-term interests of the United States. Nye also gives Trump fairly good scores for acting prudently and doing so only when absolutely necessary and proportionately and discriminatively. If we extend Nye's model to the Biden presidency, and keeping in mind that Biden is dedicated to some form of American leadership in the future and the preservation of some type of American international order, what would we expect by way of a moral foreign policy by the United States in the years to come? Nye states plainly that the term American international order is obsolete as a description of the US's place in the world today. Nevertheless, he argues, and I'm quoting him, the need remains for the largest countries to take the leading role in creating international public goods. That is, providing the world with things that we all benefit from, even though we may not necessarily contribute in equal proportion. A future rule-based international order, Nye says, ought to cover both international political affairs, military affairs, as well as economic, environmental, and human rights matters. The important moral choices facing President Biden, he writes following, quote, now, with less preponderance and more complex world, the 46th President of the United States will face moral challenges defining a foreign policy where America provides global public goods in cooperation with others and uses these goods not only in terms of advancing our hard power, that is our military and our economic power, but also employs our soft power, by which he means the attractiveness of our vision in the eyes of the world. Nye would expect Biden to articulate a moral vision that has broad appeal both at home and abroad, and one that balances the values to be advanced against the potential risks associated with advancing them. Nye would also expect Biden to use force only when absolutely necessary, and doing so discriminately and in proportion to the threat. He would further want Biden to respect the institutions, both at home and abroad, which means working with our allies and in accordance to his constitutional powers. Finally, we would expect Biden to conduct foreign policy in a way that serves the long-term interests of the United States, avowing the temptation to make decisions on the basis of short-term gains. Nye would want Biden to steer foreign policy in a way that uplifts others, or at least causes minimal disruption. He would also expect Biden to be truthful and engage the American people and the world in a broad and inclusive moral discourse. To conclude, the American international order is giving way to something else. What that is remains uncertain. The prospects of a successful American leadership abroad, and perhaps a new order that embodies that leadership, may very well depend on whether the US is successful at forging a moral foreign policy under President Biden, as well as by his successors. Thank you very much.